Equality and Opportunity study. But now I'd like to welcome Mark Fransham, who's going to be speaking today. Mark is a senior lecturer at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at Oxford, and he's currently a visiting fellow at III, the International Inequalities Institute here at the LSE. He has research interests in income inequality, poverty, social policy and demography, and he's published work on poverty dynamics, gentrification, the UK benefit cap and social polarisation. He also acts as an advisor to the Office for National Statistics, ONS, on the UK Population Theme Advisory Board and the Migration Statistics Expert Group. So welcome to Mark. Today he's going to be talking about, got to see the title on the screen, trends in spatial labour income inequality in Canada, France, Germany, the UK, over quite a long period, 1975 to 2020, sounds really interesting. The linking.
Okay, thanks everyone for being here. Today I'm going to paint a picture of how inequalities in labour income between and within local labour market areas of the UK have changed over the last 40 years and how that compares to Canada, France and Germany. And as a headline, we find that there are significant variations between countries, both in the level of spatial labour income inequalities and in the trends of how they have evolved over time. And the UK emerges as a place that has high, although not the highest, spatial inequalities in our comparative countries. We also find that apparently stagnating trends in spatial inequalities, which some people have written about, the stagnating trends in mean income inequalities hide some trends of continued divergence in terms of the highest wages that are paid across areas and some convergence in the lowest wages that are paid across areas. The different trends that we observe across our countries, we think speak to the role of national policies and national institutions in mediating the international trends, social economic trends that drive geographic inequality. And in the presentation, I'll highlight the potential role of labour market policy as a mediator of these economic trends. As you'll see, I am one of 11 people working on this project. So I'd just like to acknowledge all of my collaborators, Neil Lee at the LSE, who's here in the room, and Pavel Bukowski, previously at LSE and now at UCL on the UK team. We have collaborators at Bonn, Emory and McGill universities, and of course, acknowledge gratefully funding from the SRC as well. Okay, so of course, the issue of inequalities, spatial inequalities in the UK is not a new issue. It's something that people have studied for decades. It's something that's been the target of government policy for at least 80 years. And the idea of a north-south divide in the UK has a heritage that goes back at least 100 years. So these photos here, you can see slightly obscured on the right-hand side is a photo of Royd Mill in Oldham, and in the centre, and in the centre is the Gherkin and the City of London. So these places are kind of photos and places are emblematic of what we think about when we think about spatial divides in the UK. So we've got the financial centre of the City of London, often the centre of discussions when we talk about inequalities in the UK. Need no introduction to you. On the right-hand side is Royd Mill in Oldham. Oldham is a town in Greater Manchester. It was an industrial revolution boom town. Was once, really at the heart of the Industrial Revolution and a powerhouse in terms of cotton production in the 19th century. Of course, the fortunes of Oldham have declined since the cotton production declined from the mid-20th century, and this mill in particular closed in 1981 and was demolished in 2015. But if you go to Oldham now, if you get the tram from Greater Manchester out to Oldham, as you come up into Oldham, you pass still many of these mill buildings which have been long since abandoned, some of them used as warehousing facilities that really stand like ghosts of Oldham's past. And Oldham itself is fiercely proud of its industrial history, but is a place that, with a few bright exceptions, is somewhere that's still sort of struggling to regain its economic purpose, in stark contrast to somewhere like the City of London. And these kind of inequalities have become more politically salient in recent times. So the role of geography has been highlighted in the election of Donald Trump and the vote to leave the EU. Andres Rodriguez Pose in the geography department here at LSE has written very eloquently about Brexit and the vote for Trump and other sort of populist movements being the revenge of places that don't matter, or places that feel they don't matter, and want to take their revenge on the places like the City of London that seem to do very well. The diverging fortunes between these sorts of places can be described in lots of different ways. So people have studied these in terms of productivity, health outcomes, education outcomes, social mobility. What we're interested in our project is studying inequalities in income as a key determinant of social and economic well-being. How these have changed over time, not only in the UK, but in our comparator countries, and how they compare across different countries. And we think this is very important to understand for both the social science, to understand what drives geographic inequalities, but also for policy, to understand how both place-based policy and place-blind policy can affect geographic inequalities. Okay, so what do we already know about spatial income inequality? So we know there's a rich literature on spatial inequalities already, and we can split it between literature around inequalities between places and inequalities within places. So we have some literature on regional disparities, and when I use region here, I mean large regions within countries. So in the UK, we often see analysis of the country split into 12 regions of the UK, and big sort of north-south divides between places. And these sorts of studies have found for the UK in the 80s that there was an increase in inequalities between those large regions, but that the inequalities that grew within them were more important for explaining national income inequality. There's a rich literature around wages and productivity difference that are driven by agglomeration effects, spatial sorting, and technological change. And there's a literature, more recent literature from the UK, studying what are called travel to work areas, which I'll explain a little bit more in a moment, which are smaller, about 200 areas of the UK. That suggests that inequalities between labour market areas in the UK have declined around 2000. So on the within area inequality side, there is literature around inequality in city size, so showing that larger cities, as you might expect, tend to have higher income inequality. And there's a rich literature to which I've contributed myself around income segregation within cities and distribution of poverty, etc. But from our point of view, we want to highlight some limitations of this current literature. So one thing is that there's not a great literature that links between area inequalities to within area inequalities and tries to decompose national income inequalities, which are well studied, to the inequalities that exist within areas and the inequality that exists between areas. The other limitations include geographic scale and coverage. So these studies tend to have varying geographic scales. We've got some literature on regions for the 1980s in the UK, and then we've got literature on labour market areas for the late 2000s, which isn't very consistent over time and not very comparable. And also in terms of coverage, lots of the literature just focuses on cities and urban areas and doesn't look at spatial inequalities across the whole country. Another limitation is trends. So some of these are studies just are snapshots of inequality at a point in time and don't tell us about the evolution over time of inequalities. And the other really big gap is the comparative evidence. So we have a lot of evidence within countries about inequalities. We really know very little about how spatial geographic inequalities compare across different countries and over time in a way that might help us to understand how national policy influences spatial inequalities. Okay, all right. So these are questions that we think we would want to be able to answer, both for social science and for policy, that we feel we can't answer definitively right now. So how have spatial income inequalities evolved over time? How do they compare to other countries? How much do spatial inequalities contribute to national inequality? Are they an important driver of national inequalities? How do patterns look if we look at wages versus other sources of income? And what are the drivers of these spatial income inequalities? So big, broad questions, but we want to bring a comparative lens to be able to answer some of these questions. There are lots of methodological challenges to doing this sort of work. So the first one is geography. So as I've already alluded to, we have studies for the UK, some of which cover regions, some of which cover travel to work areas, some of which use administrative units. So it's difficult. So the first challenge is having a consistent geography over time within the same country that is a sensible geography to use, and then also having a geography that's comparable across different countries. So you'll see sometimes people trying to do quick analyses of geographic inequalities where they use administrative units to compare between different countries, and don't realise, for example, that Paris is one whole administrative unit, whereas London is chopped up, as you know, into 30 or so different administrative units. So we're not comparing like with like if you try and do a spatial analysis of those units. Another challenge is around income, the changing importance of different income sources for a start. So in the UK, we know that self-employment income has become much more important over time, and also having comparable definitions across different countries. And then finally, accounting for local costs of living. So, and this is particularly with a comparative hat on. So, so there are, as you'll know, there are in lots of countries there are wide disparities in terms of the cost of living, and in the United States, for example, the studies that accounted for the cost of living when looking at wage inequality find that wage inequality between cities is much lower when you take into account the low cost of living. So the question would be, looking across different countries, are differences in levels of wage inequality just reflective of the fact that there are differences in cost of living across those different countries? Okay, so our objectives in this project are to examine these long-run trends of geographic income inequality. We're covering 4 countries today, 5 eventually, so Canada, France, UK, Germany, United States since the 1970s, to investigate the interactions between national and local income inequalities, and then we hope to provide back to the research community a database of spatially decomposed national income distribution, so measures of spatial inequality that are comparable in terms of their geography and comparable in terms of the income definitions that they're using, and also account for these local costs of living. So I'm going to give you headlines now, and then I'll tell you how I arrived at them. So the first thing to say is that, as I've already said, the degree of spatial labour income inequalities and trends in their evolution varies substantially across our countries. That's the first thing we find. In the UK, we find that spatial labour income inequalities are high and relatively important in terms of explaining national income inequality. In Canada and Germany, we also find they're relatively high, but relatively unimportant in terms of explaining national income inequality, and I'll talk about what I mean by that. And in France, the spatial inequalities are relatively low, but still quite important in terms of explaining national inequality. Other things we find are, as I've already spoken about, divergence of the highest wages that are paid by area, but some evidence of convergence between areas in terms of the lowest wages that are paid. And we also think that we have some emerging evidence around the role of labour market institutions and policies as potential drivers of these trends. Okay, so here's a roadmap of what I'm going to quickly get through in the next 25 minutes or so. So quick run through our methods, as background, something on national wage inequality, and then talk about the trends we find in subnational wage inequality, and then linking those trends in subnational wage inequality back up to the national wage inequality that we observe, and finally, a little bit on labour market institutions. I should say, as you probably already picked up, at the moment we are only focusing on labour income inequality, and that's what all of these findings relate to. In due course, we're about midway through the project, and we're hoping later on to also examine inequalities in total income between areas across countries. Okay, so for our labour income data, I'll go through this quite quickly. We're using the new earnings survey and the annual survey of hours and earnings, which is a 1% sample of workers in the UK. We have similar data sets for both France and Germany. For Canada, we are using a census at the moment, although our colleagues in Canada are using some administrative data. In the future, the US we will get to. These results I'm showing you are mostly for full-time workers, or for those for some of the parts. There'll be information that includes part-time workers as well, mostly for 20 to 60 years old, although there's some 20 plus. And we're looking at pre-tax weekly or daily earnings. And again, later in the project, we're going to look at annual earnings as well, where we would expect inequalities to be higher in general. These are not yet adjusted for local cost of living. That's the other thing to say. Okay, with our geographic units, we are using approximations to self-contained local labour market areas constructed using commuting data. So in the UK, we're using travel to work areas. So these are areas that are defined using data from the decennial census. That essentially try and find an area where most people both live and work in that area. So they are approximations to a labour market area within which everyone lives and works. And these data on these areas doesn't exist going back to 1975, at least not in a raw form. So what we've done is we've reconstructed these areas going back from 1998 back to 1975 in the new earnings survey data set in order to have a consistent, constant geography over time. We have a similar setup in Canada, France, and Germany, where we have these self-contained labour market areas, which are defined in a similar way to the ones in the UK. And similarly, we hold those areas constant over time, and we're looking at our trends.
Can I just ask a quick question about that? For London or the larger cities, I mean, it's not quite right, is it, that you live and work within that travel to work area? I mean, it's quite, you know, it's much broader. I can see you've got a sort of greater London travel to work area there.
So yeah, the London travel to work area is very big, but it won't contain everybody. None of these travel to work areas contain everybody. Okay, yeah. So so they contain about 70%. It's about 70. Okay, thanks. Live and work in those areas. And that varies across different areas, of course, but yeah. Okay, so quickly some headlines on national wage inequality. So this is the log of the P10, P90 ratio for full-time workers in the UK. So this is the ratio between the wage at the top end of the distribution and the wage at the bottom end of the distribution for the whole of the UK from 1975 up to 2019. All of these charts that you'll see go from both from 1975 up to 2019. And you can see we get this steady rise in terms of wage inequality as defined by that up until about 2000, where it's you see it stagnates and even falls off slightly. If you include full part-time workers in that, of course, you get a much higher level of inequalities as you would expect. We can compare how this looks across different countries. So this is the same chart for the UK. This is how it looks in Germany. So again, we see a really sharp rise, but later, around about 1996, 97, and then a falling off in more recent times.
Mark, is that sort of West Germany or?
Sorry, this is just West Germany. Thank you, Neil, for reminding me to say that. And this is just West Germany, yes, exactly. And France, we see very little action in terms of national wage inequality over this period. In fact, it looks like it's fallen slightly. In Canada, we find the highest level of inequalities in our data, and they've risen slightly over this period. For Canada, at the moment, we only have data for about 1996 to 2016 from the census that takes place every 5 years. I'll come back to these later. These are sort of breaking down the bottom and the top half of the distribution, but for the sake of time, I'll stick those for now. So in terms of subnational wage inequality then, our initial measures of subnational wage inequality are to look at, for each of our local labour market areas, each of our travel to work areas and similar areas in other countries, we calculate the mean income for any given year in any given labour market area. We take the log of that mean income, and then across those different labour market areas, we calculate the variance of that log mean income. And the reason we use the log of the mean income here is because the variance is invariant to scale, basically. So if you have a distribution and multiply by 2, the variance, the variance of the log won't change. So it accounts for the fact that the level of income changes over time. So you can think of this variance of log mean income as being like the variance relative to the average. And then similarly, we look at this at different points in the distribution. So we also calculate for each of our local labour market areas the P10 wage, so the wage that defines the 10th percentile of the distribution, the P50, so the median, and the P90, the wage that defines the 90th percentile of the distribution. Take the log, take the variance, and see how much, how the dispersion of wages of those different parts of the distribution changes over time. Okay, so here's how that looks for the UK. So this is the variance of log average wage across local labour market areas. And see, the years have disappeared on the axis here. Sorry about that, but this is still year scale, still the same year scale. So you can see that this dispersion of wages between areas rises over time. So you can see it rises up until that date is 2002, and then it flattens off after this period. So when we hear about studies that say that spatial inequalities haven't changed very much since around 2000, it's this part of the chart that they're talking about. When we see there's been quite a sharp rise, and before that, in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, in terms of the average wages that are paid, in terms of the variance of the average wages that are paid across areas. So we can see that they're getting further apart in terms of their average wages. If we add full-time workers into that, we can see that the trend is very similar, but the level is slightly higher. And again, we can look at this across our different study countries. So this is the same line that we saw for full-time workers on the previous slide for the UK. For Germany, we can see also a rise in terms of the inequality between areas, in terms of their mean wages. And we see a rise later than we see in the UK. It's in around 1997, up until about 2010, 2011, and then it leveling off. But the level is not as high as it is in the UK. In France, again, we see relatively, you'll see there's a lot with France. There's not so much going on with France. And indeed, if anything, a slight convergence in terms of mean wages between areas. In Canada, again, we see it's much higher and has been rising over this period. The other thing, as I said, we looked at was different points of the distribution. So this then is the UK P50, the median wage. This is the variance in the median wage across or between areas. And again, you see a similar pattern to what we saw with the mean wage. It's a bit noisier, but we see this rise in terms of the variance of median wages up until the 1990s, and then this sort of stagnation since then, and even a slight falling away and slight evidence of convergence. But if we look at different parts of the distribution, this chart, this line here now is showing the dispersion, the variance of wages at P90, so the highest wages paid in each labour market area. And we can see that similarly, there's this trend in the 70s, 80s and 90s of rising wage inequality between areas. But that trend continues up until probably at least until the early 2000s, when we see a slight decline. So although there's been a stagnation of wage inequalities between areas in terms of the median wages that are paid, we see this increasing dispersion at the higher end of the distribution. On the other hand, we look at the bottom end of the distribution, and we see that at in terms of the dispersion of the P10 wage, we see something similar to the median wage, where we see an increased dispersion of wages at the bottom end. So this means that there's a divergence in terms, between local areas in terms of the lowest wages that have been paid. But then after about 1998, we see that coming down again, and areas getting more similar in terms of the lowest wages that are paid. We can compare this to our comparator countries once again. So again, this is the same chart we saw before. This is looking at the P90, variance of the P90 across local labour market areas. We can see for Canada, we see, just like in the UK, we see continued dispersion in terms of the P90 wages across local labour market areas. Germany, we see, again, something similar, where we see at a lower level, but nevertheless, continued divergence at the upper end of the wage distributions. France, again, not so much happening. It's a bit noisy at the start of the period, but we can see, broadly speaking, that there's been little change in the dispersion of the inequality between areas at the higher end of the distribution. This is the variance of the P10, so the lowest wages. And here we've got this line that I showed you earlier, where we get this inverse U shape of increasing divergence and then convergence in the UK over this period. These are a little bit noisy, these charts, but for Germany, we don't see a similar pattern until perhaps later on, towards 2015, when we see some evidence of convergence in terms of the lowest wages between areas. France, again, a little bit of convergence over that period, but not as much happening. So that's the sort of broad trends we see in inequalities between areas across this period. So the title of our project is Linking National to Regional Inequalities, and so what we want to do is not just describe these inequalities between places, but have a way of exploring, describing, understanding how they contribute to national inequality. So we have a couple of sort of descriptive ways that we use to do this. So one way is to calculate this thing called the raw variance share. So for each year, we calculate the R² value from this regression. So it's just a very simple model where the log of income is explained by some intercept plus a dummy variable for each of our local labour market areas. So you can think of the R² for this regression as telling us what percentage of national wage inequality is explained by the mean wage in each area. So this is the pattern that we get for the UK for full-time workers. So you can see that the proportion of explained variance was about 3% in the 1975, and that rose up to around about 8% in 2002, and then stagnated or slightly fell after that. If we look at all work, we include full-time workers, we can see that the importance of place, or the amount of variance that place explains, reduces. And you can think about that. So you can think about this as decomposing basically the inequality between areas and the inequality within areas. So if we think about the explained variance, think about area explaining 3% of the variance in national income inequality, that means that the inequality within areas explains about 97% of it. And so you can think of adding full-time workers as adding more inequality within areas than it adds inequality between areas. This is the same chart for the UK for the R squared, and now we can compare it to our different countries in our study. So you can see that France area explains a relatively large amount of the variance in total in income, and so but it doesn't change very much over the period once again, and it's a similar level to the UK in the latter part of this period. Germany and Canada, they have much lower levels of in terms of importance of place as measured by this R squared, and it changes very little over this period. A second way we can look at this, which does something very similar, is to do this basic counterfactual exercise where we calculate a ratio of the average income for a particular year, and we divide this by the average income in labour market R in a particular year, and we take this ratio and multiply each of the observations in our area by this ratio. And what that does is it basically removes the between component, or makes the mean income in each of our local market areas identical. So it means there's no difference in mean incomes between local labour market areas. So we've done this exercise, and then we can see how that changes national income inequality. So this is the result of that, and we get a similar kind of picture to what we got from the R squared raw variance share approach that I showed you a moment ago. So we can see at the top here we've got Canada and Germany with the highest levels of national income inequality, which are the solid lines, and then the dashed line is national income inequality as defined by this log 10 ratio, after doing this counterfactual exercise of making the mean income in each local labour market area the same. And you can see that it makes a sort of imperceptible difference for Canada when we conduct that exercise, and only reduces national income inequality by a small amount for Germany, which is the black line. The red line is the UK, and the blue line is France, and you can see that, as in the R squared exercise, and it makes a bigger difference to national income inequality. Place makes a bigger contribution to national income inequality than for the other two countries. Okay, so those are our sort of broad conclusions in terms of the trends that we observe in our study countries, and the relative contribution of place to national inequality in each of those countries. I just want to wrap up by talking a little bit about labour market policy and institutions, and some of the things that we observe, particularly in the UK, kind of emerging findings and emerging ideas that we have. So, there's lots of literature around the determinants of regional inequalities. So, the role of physical geography, technological education, agglomeration effects, globalization, demographics, etc. And lots of these trends are, of course, common to all high-income countries. But we think that one of the things we want to do in our project is explore the role of policy in mediating or driving geographic income inequalities, and the fact that we observe these quite different trends and levels of spatial income inequality, is suggestive of the role of national policy, national institutions in mediating these more global trends. And we'll just talk you through now one of the things we're thinking about at the moment, which is the role of labour market institutions and policy, particularly collective bargaining agreements and a national minimum wage. So this chart here is one that was produced by my colleague Pavel Bunkowski and colleagues of his that describes the union coverage and level of bargaining across high-income countries. And this chart here shows us 1980, situated in 1980 compared to other countries. And I've highlighted Great Britain, the top right-hand quadrant here. So this on the vertical axis, we've got union coverage in percent from 0 to 100%. So that's the percentage of workers who are covered by a union, and then there's a level of bargaining here which is decentralized at the left-hand side to highly centralized at the far right-hand side. And you can see here that in 1980, the UK looked like a country that had high union coverage and highly centralized wage bargaining arrangements. And one of the, okay, I'll talk about that in a minute. And we can see here the same chart in 2019, and you see that there was a big shift in the UK that was very unusual in terms of its the degree, where the UK becomes a country that has very low union coverage and highly decentralized wage bargaining over this period. And we can look at the effects of being covered by a collective wage agreement on the inequality, on spatial inequality in our data set. So what we've got here, so the red line is the line you've seen before, which is the R-squared value, the proportion of variance in income that's explained by mean wages across local labour market areas. And then we split that off in between workers that were covered by a collective bargaining agreement and those that weren't. So you can see for those that were not covered, this is the grey line here, we see an increase during the 1970s and 80s, curious fall off here. We have a break in the series where we don't observe this. And then in the 2000s and 2010s, we see that the spatial inequality between workers who are not covered by collective bargaining agreement is much higher, whereas for workers who are covered by such an agreement, which is the green line, it acts to they have much lower inequality in terms of their wages and between areas. I'm not going to talk about that for if you want to talk about, if you want to know about unemployment, I'll come back to it later. I'm not going to skip it for now for the sake of time. The other thing that we looked at is national minimum wage. So you see this red line here in the middle, again, is the UK, and this is this inverse shape that I showed you earlier about the divergence in terms of the lowest wages that are paid across areas up until the late 1990s, and then convergence in terms of the lowest wages. So the lowest wages across areas getting more similar over time in the 2000s and 2010s. I would just simply sort of plotted this against sort of changes in wage arrangements. So over the 1970s and 1980s, we've got this decline of the use of centralised wage bargaining, the decline of wage councils. And over this period, we see this rise, this in terms of inequality between areas at the lowest end of the wage distribution. After the national minimum wage is introduced, however, in 1999, we see this convergence between areas in terms of the lowest wages that are paid. And so, and we see us on the, if we look at other countries, we can see France, where very little has happened, has had a national minimum wage over this entire period. Germany introduced a national minimum wage in 2015, has seen decline, a convergence in the lowest wages since then, although it's very, very, got limited data at that point. So this needs investigating further, but it's suggestive of a role that national minimum wages play in spatial inequality. Okay, all right. So I'm going to wrap up now. So to repeat the messages from earlier, we find that the degree of spatial labour inequalities and trends varies substantially across our study countries. We find that UK inequalities are high and relatively important in terms of explaining national income inequality, high but relatively less important in Canada and Germany, and low but still quite important in terms of explaining national income inequality in France. We find this in some of our countries, this divergence of the highest wages by area, but a convergence of the lowest wages by area. And we want to sort of highlight the role of labour market institutions as potential drivers. We've also been beginning to present these to policy audiences and thinking about the policy implications that arise. So the first thing, to say to policymakers, we confirm that spatial wage inequality in the UK is high compared to other countries, but not the highest, and that inequalities within places are higher than those between them. But there are these different patterns at the top and the bottom of the distribution, and in particular, this convergence that we see at the lower end of the distribution in terms of wages that are paid is suggestive of the fact that people who are living in high cost areas are not being compensated as much for the costs of living in those high cost areas. If the wage in Bristol, which is relatively high cost area, is at the lower end of the distribution, is relatively is quite similar to the wage that's paid in Stoke-on-Trent, let's say, which is a lower cost area, then the real wage is going to be lower in Bristol than it is in Stoke-on-Trent. Global trends are really important, but we think they're just part of the story, and that we think that there's a role here for labour market institutions in terms of their impact on spatial inequality. So thank you very much for your time, and I'd be very pleased to hear any comments or questions that you've got.
Yeah, thank you very much.